Just quickly before we start, I am going to do the housekeeping things, which is that if there's a fire alarm, the exit is there, and please go down the stairs. And the ladies' toilets are just here on the right. The men's toilets, you go down the corridor to the left, and you'll find them there. We're delighted to have a panel of speakers here today, and I will do some introductions as I introduce the speakers. But we're going to start with Alison Evans, who's the director of ODI, who's going to make some initial comments and welcoming remarks.
It's a pleasure to see you all here today to mark this centenary event to mark the centenary, I should say, of International Women's Day. As you know, celebrated technically tomorrow, March the 8th. And also on such a bright and beautiful and optimistic day. And I hope that this event today will carry that flavour of optimism, of brightness, a sense of things can be done. The title of the event is called Exploring and Expanding Frontiers in Gender Development. And I think that very much sets the tone for how we want to run the day today. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I mean, it seems to me, it goes without saying, that there is indeed much to feel optimistic about in relation to issues of gender development, particularly around women's empowerment. Women have made remarkable gains in rights, in education, health status, and in access to economic opportunity over the last 20 years, plus 50 years. Women's life expectancy, their gender parity in primary education, and women's participation in tertiary education have all been improving dramatically around the globe, and particularly in developing countries, which is our focus primarily today. More countries than ever guarantee women's and men's equal rights under the law in areas such as property, inheritance, and marriage. And today, 136 countries around the world have explicit guarantees for equality of all citizens and non-discrimination between women and men in their constitutions. And a lot of this change has happened at a rate, at a pace that is historically unprecedented. So we've seen change in the last 20 years in a number of developing countries, which has been, orders of magnitude faster than some of the changes that took place in many advanced industrialized economies. And much of this has to do with the rapid pace of change in income levels, but also the positive spillover effects of change. But of course it would be a gross oversimplification to say, well, that's it, done and dusted. We're on a path, and we should celebrate the path and not continue to spot the challenges and address those challenges. Gender gaps remain egregious in many domains. From the fact that many young girls are now able to attend primary school, but the number of years of schooling that they're able to achieve still lags behind that of women increasingly taking up their place within the formal labour market, but still experience significant gaps in terms of remuneration. Legislation that has put in place the right frameworks to respect equality between women and men still faces extremely powerful and resistant social and customary institutions, making the reach of that legislation problematic. And of course, a whole range of forms of sexual and gender-based violence seem impervious to income trade. It's also the case that many women's and arguably men's experience of change can be double-edged. In the face particularly of major shocks, of increasing volatility and of economic downturn. And one thing we're very conscious of here in ODI is just how rapidly the terrain of development, the agenda in a sense, within which many of the ideas around gender equality should be and are enshrined, is actually changing incredibly rapidly. the geography of wealth, of poverty, of power, of influence is changing extremely significantly. The landscape around political voice is changing. What we're seeing in terms of potentially new politics emerging in some parts of the world today have real potential to change the face of much of the developed agenda, but also to raise all kinds of challenges around recent gains in gender equity. Populations are urbanising. There are demographic shifts underway. Technology, in many ways, is changing the rules of the game. But at the same time, we see a new, more sinister pattern of violence, of conflict and insecurity, which has the real potential to lock many populations and women within those populations in the most appalling situations of fear and poverty. We are, in many ways, in a more fluid and more mobile, and arguably less certain world. And it seems to me, as we think about expanding frontiers for gender and development, we have to factor those things into not only how we understand and frame the problems, but also how we think about solutions. How do we engage with this rapidly changing development landscape? How do we think about the prospects of technology in bringing about and supporting progressive change, but equally how do we engage with the appalling practices that are getting expressed through increased violence and criminality, and much of it aimed towards women. The purpose of this event today is, as I said, really about trying to tease out what can be done, what has been done and has been shown to work, what can be done, and how can we harness some of the features of this rapidly changing development landscape in a progressive, scalable, transformative way. Now these are big challenges, and I think we've always, somewhat within the field of gender development, felt that the complexity is such, the difference is such, the problems of going to scale is such, that we've ended up focusing much of our attention on sort of the micro, the small examples of change, and celebrating those. Well, that's vital, but we need to be able to move beyond those and think about going to scale, and think about how we can get transformation along a whole host of lines working together. And I think some of today's conversation will help us to think that through. So this is a day, obviously, to acknowledge the remarkable changes that have taken place in all of our lives, but particularly for a significant number of women around the world for whom their opportunities today are indeed much brighter than they may have been 20 years ago, but that there is also a huge amount to be done, and the nature of, I think, gender inequity is changing and has potential to change, not entirely in progressive directions, and that's what we need to be alert to. We're delighted to have such a fantastic panel. Welcome Baroness, who's a member of our ODI Council and has been a great advocate for many of these issues. Maxine, who's been a fantastic thinker and researcher and advocate on a whole range of gender development issues for her entire career. Caroline, you're going to chair this morning's session. Thank you to Caroline, to Nicola from the ODI side, and also to the Chronic Poverty Research Centre for helping us to organise and facilitate this event today. And I hope it's going to be a terrific series of conversations, and I look forward to them. Thank you very much.
Okay, I should introduce myself. I'm Caroline Harper. I run the social development programme here, which focuses largely on gender and age issues. I just want to refer you to the agenda. We're going to hear from our three speakers. Sajida, I don't know if you want to sit here with us at the moment. Then we're going to have a very quick coffee break whilst we set up a link with UN Women. That is a quick coffee break because after our discussion session, we're having an informal lunch here, which is a networking opportunity. So I will call you all back quite promptly, but please do get a coffee at that time. As Alison said, this session is about new frontiers. We do think that we have made some considerable progress in many countries, but we recognise that there are many new challenges and many new frontiers now that we have to address and overcome. And that is the way in which we designed the agenda, was to identify areas around violence, economic and social empowerment, and indeed institutional frontiers, including the bodies that we work for, in terms of thinking through these new frontiers. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Baroness Kinnock. I'm sure she doesn't need an introduction, but she was the Labour Party member of the European Parliament from 1994 to 2009. She was awarded a life peerage when she joined the government in 2009 and holds the position of opposition spokesperson for international development. As you've heard, she's also a member of our ODI Council and a tireless campaigner for women's rights overseas. I should also point out that we are streaming this online, so we do have 50 or 60 people who've signed up and are watching over the internet, and will also hopefully ask questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and I also would like to thank the ODI and pay tribute to its continuing strong commitments both to gender issues and of course to much more. And I can assure Alison that all of us here this morning are very bright and very optimistic. So we go back to 1911, when women had no votes, when they faced appalling work conditions with virtually no rights of representation or redress, and for all but the most fortunate of women, a life of toil and drudgery. Schooling was superficial and childbirth carried terrible risks. My grandmothers, who both lost babies, lived in those pre-war years. And it was the lives of those working class women that spurred Pankhurst in 1903 to found the Women's Social and Political Union. So that's why this is an important time, an important centenary, for us to recognise where we've come, but also what the length of the journey other women, in particularly other parts of the world, will have to take. What we have to recognise is that whatever has been achieved for women and girls 100 years later, it remains very much work in progress. Gender discrimination is pervasive, and indeed it is pernicious. And to varying degrees, women don't enjoy equal access to resources, to opportunities, or political power in any region of the world. They are disproportionately affected by poverty, by violence, and they make up most of the world's poor and illiterate people. And this, when gender equity has such a multiplier effect, when it is the most important linkage between the 8 MDGs, for example, between girls' education and women's health and education and MDG targets, all of those things are so clearly linked together. So that multiplier effect has to be something that we take much more seriously as we look forward to 2015. I have been extremely privileged over many years to meet many wonderful women who have courageously opposed discrimination and tyranny and who have endured personal tragedies. And these are women who are not victims, who are not just vulnerable. They are women who are resilient and dynamic and who long for opportunity and long for change. The reality is that MDG targets will simply not be met in countries where the needs and status of women continue to be a low priority. That I believe to be an irrefutable fact. No history, religion or cultural tradition can justify the inequality which exists on such a scale. The disproportionate impact of poverty on women and girls is not an accident, but it is the result of systemic discrimination, which has to be tackled, and I think that is what our message has to be from here today. That means, for instance, dealing with the key barriers to girls' education, including by providing scholarships to girls, by providing cash transfers, eliminating school fees. It means being able to track and report on programmes through the use of gender disaggregated data and statistics. It means strengthening accountability in line with CEDAW and Beijing commitments, and it means reducing women's work burden, because if their domestic responsibilities are so huge, how on earth can we expect them to achieve all these ambitions? It is also important to scale up instruments of gender equity through including gender-responsive budgeting. Quite a formidable list, but one essential element is still missing: the critical discussion that has to take place when we know that women currently only make up 19% of the world's legislators. And it will take 40 years for us to reach anything like parity. Systems of guaranteed seats for women do exist in countries like Rwanda, and the results, as we know, are very positive. And millions of women face the threat and the reality of violence, which affects everything from security to the economy to schooling and to health. Nearly half of the sexual assaults worldwide are against girls under 15. 29% of national governments report that they lack laws or policies to prevent violence against women. It's encouraging now to anticipate the cooperation that will take place, and this is, I think, a very positive aspect of what we will be discussing today, is that cooperation, which I think will take place between Michelle Bachelet, UN Women Agency, and Margaret Wallström, who is the UN Special Representative on tackling sexual violence. We can now really begin to hope that Resolution 1325 will become a reality on the ground, and that we will see accountability and, critically, an end to impunity, and that sexual violence itself will be seen as a threat to international peace and security. Both human and financial reasons will have to be devoted to this task by the resources will have to be devoted to this task by the United Nations, and member states must contribute and also implement their own national plans. And the role of civil society, of course, in monitoring and strengthening 1325 will be a critical aspect of these aspirations as well. And in the conflict and post-conflict situation, when women are routinely raped and abused, too often that impunity continues to prevail. I have sat on the floor in a tent in Darfur, talking to women about why it is they who have to leave the camp to collect firewood. Or with women in eastern Congo a few months ago who were brutally attacked and left for dead. One was 7 months pregnant, one of the others had several broken bones. And their stoicism was, I have to say, deeply affected, and I struggled to hold myself together in that discussion that we had. What do you say to tired, impoverished, war-weary women who have little or no hope of redress? They are traumatised, and only one of their husbands had visited them. I will never ever forget meeting those women in Congo, or their agonised concern, not for themselves, but for their children. Dr. Mukwege asked me to speak to the assembled crowd of women in his hospital, Tanzi Hospital. And I asked him what I should say to the women. And he said, all you have to say is tell them that you know about them and that you will never forget them. He always wears a badge on the lapel of his doctor's coat which says, don't stand idly by. And I think that is something that I certainly hope that everyone in this room would think is what we should be doing. I can think of nothing more important for us to do for those women and the millions of others who don't need just our sympathy, but they need to see some real action, as they, of course, will carry the stigma of having been raped for the rest of their lives. And these women need to be drawn into the peace processes. Of 300 ceasefire agreements since 1989, just 18 have contained even a passing reference to women. On Bosnia, Liberia, Sierra Leone and Somalia, the peace accords are silent on women. And in Afghanistan, women continue to face denials of their human rights. 1 in 8 women die in childbirth, the highest rate in the world. 87% of women are illiterate. In Taliban areas, they are denied constitutional rights, the right to be educated, to work outside the home, and all of this, of course, under threat of violence and death. And President Karzai fails to articulate the case for women's rights, and he continues to demonstrate a willingness to use those rights as a bargaining chip, with support, of course, from traditional leaders. Afghan women fear that if Taliban commanders are given political power in any reconciliation process without restrictions and without the involvement of women, they will see this as a threat which will realistically affect them very seriously indeed. What we do know is that brave Afghan women continue to make efforts and break out of the cycle, to break out of that cycle of early marriage, of segregation, of brutality, and of repression. A couple of weeks ago, I was in South Sudan with the all-parliamentary group, and I was privileged with members of the APG to meet many focused and determined women. They know that their new country will face enormous challenges, and that high expectations in that country will have to be very carefully managed. More than half of the population of South Sudan don't have access to safe drinking water. About 80% of adults are illiterate, and malaria is hyper-endemic. Last year, there were 3 million people or more that were dependent upon food assistance. Everyone there talks about building a state from scratch, and that will be the phrase that sticks in my mind, from scratch. I never heard it mentioned so many times as I did in our meetings there. At the Legislative Assembly, we were assured by women MPs, they have 54 women in the Legislative Assembly, 48% elected from a women's list. They said that it was women's votes which made the result such a success, and that as MPs they will focus on further political and social change. And what they said, one of the women said to us, for women the separation means liberation. They were very focused on working on the building a secular state, and also on a state committed to equal treatment, and that will be a central part of the new constitution. We also met families that are very little to eat. Natalia was with me when we met a woman who was in the rural areas just outside Juba, and all the children were having to eat were mangoes. Mangoes that were not ripe off a nearby tree. They had absolutely nothing, and the children were clearly very, very malnourished. In Juba, we also, and I was very reminded of the project which Sarah and others have been involved with on urbanisation in Sudan, when I visited the city, because you do have a sense that the urban poor are actually being left to their own devices in Juba, and we saw levels of poverty which were very, very shocking indeed, and I have seen quite a bit of that in my time. We saw a Street Children project for girls, where amazing things were being done to support these young girls. And we were told that they hang around in the market, they scavenge for food, but ultimately what often happens is that the girls say, well, in the market they rape you, at least in the brothel they pay you. In South Sudan there's a great deal of gender-based violence which is underreported and spreading. And given the long history of conflict, certain traditional practices are very weak in the judicial system. The practices in the judicial system are so weak that it's very difficult for women to have access to justice. And the tendency to revert to customary law is something that we need to be dealt with. In the north, regrettably, it looks like we will see a retrenchment of fundamentalist views. Women in the north and the south point out that the CPA requires laws to be changed in order to bring them into line with international human rights. we met a formidable group of leading activists in Khartoum who fear a further narrowing of their political space. They raised for us very forcibly the need for the urgent reform of the public order regime, which on a daily basis affects the personal, economic and professional lives of these women. The activities of the police are increasing, as are the imposition of the draconian laws. The impact of this graphically described to us as a religious ideology, was graphically described to us as a religious ideology intent, absolutely intent, on the oppression of women. That is why we must maintain our vigilance on Darfur, on the south, and I believe very seriously on the potential for escalation of repression of women in the north of Sudan. Just finally, on UN Women, Michelle Bachelet has clearly said that she's not going to say things like, oh, here we are, we have a nice project for women here, and we'll get it funded. That's not what UN Women is going to be about. The new agency will, I believe, be bold and ambitious, and intent on being practical and making a lasting difference to women's lives, and of course, very importantly, tapping into the enormous capacity women have to drive development. And I can only say here to that.